بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ضيوفنا الكرام، نلتقي بكم مجدداً لنواصل أعمال المؤتمر الرابع لهيئة جودة التعليم والتدريب، ونود التأكيد على أن جلسات المؤتمر تبث كاملة ومباشرة على قناة هيئة جودة التعليم والتدريب في اليوتيوب BQA_BH، كما أن جميع أوراق العمل ستكون متوافرة على الموقع الإلكتروني للمؤتمر. نبدأ الآن بالجلسة الأولى تحت عنوان الامتحانات عالية الأهمية ومستقبل المدارس نحو الانتقال إلى المنصات الإلكترونية، والتي ستمتد بإذن الله حتى الساعة 12:30 ظهراً. ويسرنا دعوة الأستاذة أميرة البلوشي، رئيس قسم في إدارة مراجعة أداء المدارس الخاصة ورياض الأطفال بهيئة جودة التعليم والتدريب لتقديم ضيوفها الكرام وإدارتها مشكورة، فلتتفضل.
Good morning and welcome to the first session of the BQA conference. It is our pleasure to have with us Dr. Bethany Fishbein and Mr. Tony Mcelidy. Please leave any questions you have to the speakers in the Q&A section, and we'll be happy to attend to them after the presentations. Allow me a moment to share the presentation, please. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bethany Fishbein. She is the Assistant Research Director for Psychometrics and Data Analysis at IAA's TIMS and Pearls International Study Center at Boston College in the United States. She has worked in international large-scale assessment for almost 10 years. Dr. Fishbein, the mic is yours. Just allow me to give you control of the presentation, and you should be ready to go.
Oops. Okay, all set. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. Very delighted to be here. My name is Bethany Fishbein, and I'm from the TIMS and Pearls International Study Center at Boston College, where I've spent many years studying testing mode effects and helping to facilitate the transition of the TIMS and Pearls international assessments to become digital. Today, I'll talk about the possibilities and considerations for transitioning existing paper-based assessments to a digital platform, but in the context of high-stakes assessments. I'll begin by giving a brief overview of high-stakes assessments and their importance in education, and then I'll discuss the many considerations involved when transitioning to a digital assessment system, with the emphasis on the many benefits of undergoing this change. High-stakes assessments provide critical measures of the degree that students have attained the knowledge and skills prescribed by the curriculum during the primary and secondary school years. Without high-stakes assessments, low-performing or disadvantaged students might go unnoticed and not be given remediation or resources needed to succeed in education and career. Because decisions made based on their results can have such major consequences for individuals, it's important that the assessments are valid and fair. The test should measure exactly what it purports to measure, and it should be proven valid for each intended use of the scores. There are 4 common ways that scores from high-stakes assessments are used, which have consequences for individual students. The practice of tracking involves grouping students for instruction according to their ability as measured by these assessments. The assessments can determine whether students should be promoted to the next grade higher. They're used to determine eligibility to graduate from secondary school. And there are also examinations used by colleges and universities to select applicants for admission. When high-stakes assessments are used for reasons other than having consequences for the test taker, such as for measuring school effectiveness, we typically assume these are secondary uses. And schools may use high-stakes test scores to make decisions about allocating resources. For example, teachers might be given additional professional development courses or instructional resources in a certain curricular area. The proper use of high-stakes assessment can have a positive impact on academic achievement. They help to set goals for student attainment and improvement, and they also help motivate students to try hard in school and succeed. Oops, went forward. Sorry about that. They can motivate students to try hard in school and succeed on the exams. Some of the world's highest achieving countries on international assessments have rigorous high stakes exams at each of the stages of education. And students spend a lot of time preparing, and parents will invest money in tutoring and other resources to ensure their child succeeds. But because of the potential for negative consequences, high stakes assessments are often perceived and scrutinized as being unfair, which might lead to increased likelihood for cheating or wrongdoing. Transitioning a paper-based high-stakes assessment to a digital delivery system can help promote their productive use and in a way that's much more efficient and more authentic for students. Around the world, students are increasingly using digital devices for learning and interacting with others, and even more so because of the COVID pandemic. TIMSS 2019 results found that over 85% of students in Bahrain have access to digital devices and the internet at home. Even before the pandemic, many assessments made the transition to become digital. And this includes assessments of all types for primary and secondary school students, students of all abilities in all the key content areas, and for both low and high stakes purposes. It's important that transitioning high stakes assessments to digital systems is done carefully and in consideration of all the challenges and potential impacts on student performance, as well as perceptions of stakeholders in the school communities. Because negative perceptions of high stakes exist in these school communities, there's likelihood for public scrutiny of the transition, and there could be accusations of unfairness even where it does not exist. So the one major challenge in transforming to a digital system is that it's very resource intensive, particularly for its initial development. It's not always feasible to use an existing digital test software or platform. And that's because the system really needs to meet the needs of the particular assessment. Developing digital systems and applications is time consuming and often requires collaboration with professionals outside of psychometrics and education, including computer programmers and user interface designers. Building a new system will initially require pilot studies to try out new item types and validate new scoring procedures. And all of the challenges in developing a digital system can vary by content area, and they can have varying development needs. For example, a mathematics assessment requires that students be able to answer items using numbers and mathematical symbols, while in a science assessment, students need to articulate facts and evidence. The considerations for test administration when transitioning to digital can vary depending on the needs of the particular assessment. The first challenge is the initial investment in testing devices and other IT equipment, which must be kept secure, especially in a high stakes context. It's preferred to use devices that students are familiar and comfortable with using, and students' preferences may evolve over time as technology advances, so you may need to update the devices. During the testing session, trained staff may be needed to help solve device or software issues that could occur during the test. And the stability of the internet connection is a major factor, especially when large numbers of students are taking the test simultaneously in one location. So plans need to be in place in case a student's device stops working or their software crashes to prevent the loss of data. One of the most important challenges for digitally transforming high stakes assessments is ensuring that the test scores have the same meaning as they did on paper. With high stakes, test developers must ensure that certain groups wouldn't be disadvantaged by this new testing mode and possibly advantaging others. If wrong decisions are made based on these scores, it could unfairly impact groups in the population, especially if the lack of comparability is associated more with some types of individuals, such as those less familiar with using computers. Unfortunately, however, research has repeatedly shown that student test performance can be affected by the use of paper versus digital assessments. Depending on the reporting goals of the particular assessment, there can be different ways to correct for any mode differences, including establishing entirely new proficiency level standards based on the digital test. When digital scores must remain comparable with paper, such as when a transition is done gradually or when trends over time need to be measured, more sophisticated equating techniques could be needed. There are many ways to help mitigate the potential for mode effects, including strategically designing a user interface for the test delivery software and conducting pilot studies throughout development. An example of this is when designing an assessment software, test developers should make sure items are presented the same way across different devices to ensure fairness and standard administration. Interface tools provided through this assessment software, such as calculators or rulers, help to ensure a standard test administration. But when developing test items, it should be noted that too many tools that the student might not need to answer items can be distracting or can mislead the student. Especially for younger students, a directions and practice module at the beginning of the test provides an opportunity to try out the response actions for the various item types to ensure that students aren't disadvantaged by the testing mode. And it's likely that these extra directions and practice would only be needed at the start of a transition to digital, when digital assessment is still relatively new for students. When beginning a digital transformation of an already established assessment, pilot studies are very important to understand the impact of the testing mode. You also want to use pilot studies to make sure students are comfortable with the interface and the item types and that it's easy to use. And pilot studies also can help just make sure a school's infrastructure can handle test administration. If the assessment system is designed right the first time, you won't need to continue to monitor mode effects later on. So despite these many challenges involved in the resources, high stakes assessments are well suited to digital environments. There are many benefits of using a digital platform, including improved measurement and greater adaptability for student needs. It also increases the efficiency of assessment processes, especially for distributing test items and scoring, and it can also help enhance test security. And I'll talk about some of these in the next few slides. One of the major benefits of digital assessment is increased engagement of test takers. Non-response bias is one of the biggest issues in high stakes testing, leads to less precise and less reliable scores. So non-response bias involves students maybe lacking motivation to respond to items when they're not well targeted to their ability. They're either too difficult or too easy, which can lead to boredom or fatigue. And especially in a high stakes context, it could cause anxiety, which could negatively impact test performance. In addition to engaging students, the variety of item types and features available with the digital platform can make it easier to assess higher order skills like problem solving that historically have always been difficult to assess with paper and pencil tests. And a greater variety of items and item types can help reduce negative impacts of teaching to the test. And this is a phenomenon associated with high stakes assessments and can happen when teachers and schools face unfair pressure to improve student achievement and focus instruction on the test items. When assessments are all paper-based, focusing instruction on the test items might mean that less attention is given to fostering higher order skills and could disadvantage students who need more varied instructional approaches. But with digital, there's a greater variety of items that are interactive and authentic. And so if teaching to the test does occur, the detriment to the student learning should be less severe. Process data is another way digital assessment can enhance measurement. So the test delivery software records every single action taken by the student during the test in what's called a log file. And this includes all clicks to navigate, use interface tools, and changing answers. And the sequential steps can be analyzed to identify patterns in steps students follow to solve problems. And you can understand students' assessment process, hence the name process data. These data can also be used to detect aberrant response behaviors. The ability to machine score responses makes the scoring process much more efficient, but it also eliminates issues related to scoring reliability as well as scorer bias, which can be a contributing factor to high stakes assessments being perceived as unfair. Digital assessment can enhance the fairness of an assessment overall by ensuring that procedures are standard for all students, but also can provide special accommodations for students who need them. Test developers can capitalize upon features of digital systems to create test forms, either in advance or even automatically during the test session on command. For high stakes assessments where inferences need to be made for individuals, multi-stage adaptive testing models are very well suited. And these models ensure students receive items covering all areas of the framework while simultaneously selecting items targeted to the student's ability. So under this model, a student will answer one group of items. Their answers are automatically scored by the computer, and the computer makes an initial estimate of their ability. Then the computer will select another group of items for the students targeted to that ability. And this will help make sure students are engaged and reduce non-response. And make sure scores are precise for decision making. A note of warning that these computer adaptive testing models require a lot of assessment items. However, in the high stakes context, a greater number of unique test forms is a benefit. Although there might be increased burden on test developers, students can answer fewer items and still get a precise estimate of their ability. The negative perceptions that surround high stakes assessment can lead to desperate measures to ensure high performance, including cheating by students or even by school staff. However, the digital platform makes it much more difficult to cheat on these tests for a number of reasons. First, there are larger numbers of test forms possible, so it's much less likely that students sitting near each other will have the same items, and coaching students or sharing items between sessions is not practical. Another thing that has happened with paper-based assessments is with graphing calculators, and students might program in cheat sheets and notes. But with digital, the calculators are provided through the software, and they're the same for all students. And then another threat to test security can even be by teachers or staff, especially when there's accountability practices. And they, for example, they might fill in missing responses with the correct answer after the test session. But because the test sessions are controlled by the computer and the data files are either encrypted or uploaded right to the cloud for scoring, it'd be practically impossible for any individual to modify the responses once the test is over. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you for giving us a perspective of the future of assessment. Dr. Fishbein's presentation focused on the importance and challenges, importance and benefits of shifting from paper-based assessment to digital assessment. And now it's time to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Tony Mcelidy. Allow me just a moment. You can take control back. All right. Mr. Tony Mcelidy. He is the Research Director for Education Development Trust, EDT. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford, and he has 40 years of experience in different aspects of K-12 education and school reform. Tony, the mic is yours. Just allow me to give you control of the presentation, and that should be it.
Great. Thank you, Amira. Hello, my name is Tony Mcelidy. I'm the Research Director of Education Development Trust, joining you from the UK. A great pleasure to be speaking at this important conference. And I'd like to pay tribute to the BQA for organizing the event. My brief presentation today is called Lessons from the Pandemic: How Can School Systems Worldwide Build Back Better? I can begin with some context. Let me tell you a little bit about Education Development Trust. We are an international not-for-profit organization working to improve education outcomes around the world. We design and deliver school improvement and careers guidance interventions. We undertake consultancy and educational research with a particular focus on the identification of promising practice in school reform. And all of our research is freely available on our website. We've been very busy during the COVID emergency. These are just a few of our activities. We've been working with the Ministry of Education and UNICEF in Jordan to ensure learning continuity on a project called Learning Bridges. We provided inputs to the quality assurance of distance learning provision during school closure in the UAE, where we've been working closely over the years with the authorities in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and the federal government. Education Development Trust is based in the UK, and we've been heavily involved in developing teacher capacity for online teaching in London during school closure. On the research side, we've been documenting global education policy response to the health emergency for a new global partnership known as the EdTech Hub, which is funded by the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, and the UK government. Today, I'd like to consider 6 lessons from the health emergency. To begin, countries have responded very differently to the practical challenges of organizing high-stakes tests during the period of school closure. And this raises interesting questions about the best way of organizing these tests in the future. Next, worldwide, disadvantaged students have suffered greater learning loss than advantaged students. And to deal with this problem, we need rich, disaggregated data, and we need action that makes the catch-up of the disadvantaged a priority. Thirdly, we've been reminded that education professionals, teachers, school leaders, district officials need clarity about what we expect of them, and they need professional development that's effective and closely aligned to expectations. Fourth, we've learned a lot during the crisis about the strengths and weaknesses of technology for learning and our capacity to make the best use of the technology. We've been reminded of the scale of the digital divide. Fifth, during the period of home learning, we were reminded of the important role of parents and the community as partners for learning. Engagement with families and the wider community will be essential as part of building back better. And last, we need to establish a balance of support and challenge for school professionals. Different forms of accountability are important. This includes the use of tests and examinations, but also other forms of accountability, such as inspection and external review. And I'd like to congratulate the BQA for the highly imaginative approach that the agency has taken during school closure in Bahrain. So let's look at these lessons in a little more detail. So governments have responded differently to the practical challenge of organizing high-stakes tests during the crisis. In France, external examinations were replaced temporarily by teacher assessment. In Egypt, online tests were used for grades 10 and 11 examinations. In Germany, in-person tests continued, but were conducted in socially distanced groups. Prompted by the crisis, there's been a lively debate worldwide about high-stakes tests. Some have suggested that they are not necessary. We should simply focus on formative assessment, but I disagree. I think that the right tests are an important indicator of quality. And without good tests, for example, it's difficult to know whether disadvantaged students are well served. At the same time, this is clearly a good opportunity for us to reflect on how best to organize tests. And such matters as the frequency, the design, the use of technology, and the mix of supervised examinations and teacher-marked coursework. These questions have been quite strongly debated in the UK just now. In England, the decision was taken to cancel in-person tests on a temporary basis. An attempt was made to use a statistical algorithm to moderate teacher assessments, and this proved highly problematic, and in the end, it was abandoned by the government. And this has prompted discussion about the wisdom of an earlier decision, 2013 policy decision, because in that year it was decided to end the assessment of coursework as a key part of the school examinations. So in England, the big national tests for 16 and 18-year-olds no longer have a coursework component. Everything depends on performance in the exam room. And some commentators have stated that the absence of coursework contributed to the difficulty of awarding grades last year. However, the government continues to dislike coursework because ministers think that it favors advantaged students and schools. And I think it's good that we are debating these matters. I want to talk about the equity gap in schools. Of course, the gap existed before the crisis, but it's generally recognized that in many countries, the pandemic has been an equity catastrophe with a dramatic increase in the learning gap between the most and least privileged. And our response needs to be data-driven and assessment-driven. We need to measure and analyze the level of learning loss of individual students, but also understand groups of students from different backgrounds in terms of, for example, gender, ethnicity, poverty level, disability. We need to track learning recovery. So we need rich assessment data, but we also need to act. Building back better will require that disadvantaged students get an explicit focus in plans. And I think a disproportionate share of resources. If they've fallen further behind than other students, we need to do more to help them to catch up. So policy to build back better should prioritize the needs of the disadvantaged. We need some creative thinking about learning recovery. Let me tell you about a very interesting catch-up program supported by the UK government for students in England. It's called the National Tutoring Program. We know from research that one-to-one tuition is very powerful, but that typically it is the preserve of better off students who access tutors often outside school in evenings and weekends. Evidence confirms that when effectively implemented, tutoring yields substantial positive impacts on learning outcomes for disadvantaged students. So in England, the government has provided funding so that additional in-school tutors are assisting 250,000 disadvantaged students, working either one-to-one or in small groups. And the tutoring is designed to provide a supplement to high quality classroom teaching. And some people are now saying this should be more than a temporary response. There should be permanent mechanisms for giving disadvantaged students access to personalized tuition. When we researched how different countries were responding to the emergency, we were struck by the variability in explicit expectations and what I would call role specificity. Teachers and head teachers need clarity about roles and access to first-class professional learning. Governments in some countries, Costa Rica, France, New Zealand, issued very precise instructions. But in some countries during the period of school closure, there was a lack of clarity about what was expected. One colleague in a country I will not name said to me, the teachers, they think they are on holiday. That was not helpful. Linked to this question of expectations was a widespread failure to provide teachers with training about what they should do to maintain learning continuity. In some ways, school reopening will be even more difficult than school closing, and teachers need help. And the period of school reopening will bring fresh challenges requiring role clarity and linked professional development. And of course, we know that the best professional development is not delivered in off-site workshops, but is school-based, sustained, practical, collaborative. Teacher professional development matters greatly. I'd like to mention an impressive example of collaborative professional development from Latin America. Comunidad Ateña is an online community of teachers across Latin America supported by the Vaki Foundation. Membership increased from 6,000 to 13,000 during the period of school closure. Teachers shared hundreds of ideas for excellent lessons online. And now the community is helping teachers to prepare for school reopening. I think that teachers often benefit from collaborative learning rather than top-down instruction by external experts. And in this case, the collaborative learning was greatly assisted by the smart use of technology. We read in books about the concept of the community of practice, but Comunidad Ateña demonstrated that this can be made a reality at scale if we make good use of technology. So technology can be important in the context of teacher professional development, and the crisis has reminded us that it's important in student learning. I think the emergency has taught us a lot about the role of technology for learning, and we must not go back to normal. Of course, students need access to devices and connectivity, and we must address the digital divide, but that's not enough. The crisis has highlighted teacher weakness in online pedagogy. We've learned a lot about technology and instructional design. We know more about the different benefits of synchronous and asynchronous instruction. Online tests provided valuable low-stakes assessment opportunities. In many low-income countries, we've been reminded of the power of low-tech as well as high-tech. Far more students engaged in radio-based learning and online learning in many low-income countries. The last year has been, if you like, an experiment in the better understanding of the use of homework. We've learned, for example, that many students undertaking home learning benefit from a high level of structure and scaffolding and can be demotivated by too much open-ended work. So I think now we need a homework revolution that builds on these insights. We need to apply what we've learned to a future of high-impact blended learning for school students. This should be a focus for teacher professional development. I've been impressed to learn about how IBM are working with the UK Connected Learning Centre, developing online programs of support intended to help teachers understand best practice in the design of blended teaching and learning, ensuring a good mix of traditional face-to-face engagement and learning activities that use smart digital technologies. Partnership between school, parents, and the wider community is key to learning recovery. During the period of school closure, some governments emphasized the importance of communication with parents and the mobilization of community resources. And these relationships will be vital to the process of building back better. Community leaders and mass media should be used to promote the importance of learning recovery. Above all, we need a dialogue with parents about partnership. And in this context, I think that school leaders have a pivotal role, explaining how students can catch up lost learning, school, in the home, and in the community. This slide shows a picture of a community health volunteer in Kenya. People like this made a big contribution to learning continuity. in some very disadvantaged areas. In some of the most deprived rural areas, 90% of students remained engaged in learning during the period of school closure because of the household level promotion of home learning by these community health volunteers. The volunteers also demonstrated the importance of gathering data, rich data at household level as well as school level. And now the schools in Kenya are reopening and the volunteers are ensuring that vulnerable students return to school. And we have documented this promising case study in a research report, which is on our website. So my final lesson concerns accountability. Education professionals need challenge as well as support, and we need to get the balance right. I began by talking about high stakes examinations, but of course tests are just one form of school accountability. School closure and school reopening have been problematic and stressful for education professionals. This may have caused some policymakers to conclude that the emergency was not the time to focus on schools accountable. I think this was a mistake. Obviously, harsh accountability can be counterproductive and demotivating, but smart accountability incentivizes good practice and is the basis for powerful self-evaluation and professional learning. And students need advocates, and the experience of students, especially disadvantaged students, should be monitored so that we know that they are learning. So in teaching, as in other respective professions, there's a need for high accountability as well as very high levels of respect and support for teachers. And in international terms, the BQA in Bahrain has been exceptional in emphasizing the importance of quality assurance and advocacy during the health emergency. So BQA saw the COVID crisis as an example of a disruptive emergency. There's a responsibility in exceptional circumstances to review the response of schools and the extent to which the basic right of students to learn is being met. The approach enabled both external and internal evaluation. Guidance was provided to schools that emphasized that the review of provision during school closure was a joint process involving BQA, but also the institution. The evaluation indicators gave schools a framework for the conceptualizing of the key components of good provision in an emergency setting. This approach also highlights for me the complementary nature of testing and external review as forms of accountability. Good tests provide validation that in some cognitive areas, students are making progress. However, tests have limited explanatory power. They don't tell you why some schools are more effective than others. Tests can identify that in some ways students are doing well or badly, but they do not set a developmental agenda in the way that good external review can do. And I think the BQA approach to school review has this diagnostic and explanatory power. And I urge you, if you're not familiar with it, to look at the information on the BQA website. So those are my 6 lessons from the pandemic. And together with my colleagues at Education Development Trust, we have written about these topics in a series of reports that are available on our website. So please do have a look if you'd like to know more. And now I look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Tony. You've given us many ideas to ponder on. Mr. Mcleby's presentation gave us a reflection of school responses worldwide to the crisis and lessons learned from them to build back better. Let me just stop the sharing so we can take the questions, different questions that we've had. Bethany, the first question maybe is directed to you. With talking about digital assessment, there's always the challenge of the privacy. For example, the issue of remote live proctoring, for example, or students opting to take their tests from home. How do you deal with such challenges?
Well, yes, the remote live proctoring type softwares are pretty invasive. They, they record a video of the student. It's tracking eye movement. It's all the audio in the room, all the data on keystrokes, and sometimes they're actually monitored by real people that work for these software companies. But they've also been criticized because we're not sure exactly how they're using all this data to decide what constitutes, aberrant behavior. There are some ways for privacy measures. Some of the software companies actually encourage schools to, also use them to maintain student records and grade books. And I would advise against that practice. I think, you can randomize student ID numbers and then, offline, off the system, connect students back with the student names and everything using the randomized IDs. But these software have received negative press. Recently, during the pandemic, they've been used a lot more than in previous years. But there's actually an article published earlier this month in Vice that reported on all the ways students are continuing to cheat on exams despite using these software. I think it might be better perhaps some of my colleagues will disagree, but in a low stakes context. And there are also options where perhaps the teacher can act as proctor remotely rather than a stranger. I think for high stakes, it's a little bit dangerous when people are already worried about the test being fair. It could just, draw more questions. Are students, some students being advantaged when they're at home? Is somebody helping them? And some students, we don't know about all the students' home lives. Perhaps it's more distracting and, causes them anxiety to be at home rather in a structured school setting. So I would argue for high stakes tests, conducting the test in school and, during the pandemic, you need to make the groups, the classroom smaller and far apart would be a better solution.
Tony, you talked about filling in the gap, especially to the disadvantaged. When we're getting back to the new normal, let's say, how do schools handle actually covers their need to accommodate their teachings to the required curriculum, as well as handling the gap in students' learning? What are the practical steps that schools can take?
Sure, I think it's a really important question. By the way, just building on what Bethany said, I think generally as we think about the experience we've been through and the lessons we can learn, that there's a range of ethical issues that we need to get hold of, that we haven't really had the time to spend enough time reflecting on while we've been in crisis management mode. But going forward and addressing your question, I mean, my own advice would be that policymakers and governments should send out messages that are reassuring about giving schools a degree of autonomy in terms of the way they make decisions about the most appropriate modification of the curriculum, so that schools don't feel that they're going to get into trouble if they're not covering all of the content. Exactly what content you should then prioritize? Well, I think there's a debate to be had about that. I mean, I think it's obvious for young children that if they're falling behind in key literacy and numeracy skills, that's going to be a big problem unless we can remediate it, and that should be a priority. But I also think that children have lost out in terms of the richness of the curriculum as well over the last year, and the benefits of the rich curriculum of physical education, of the arts, in terms of the development of the whole child. We mustn't forget that. We mustn't forget that either. I think we've got to be creative. I think the tuition program in London I mentioned is a nice example of some creative thinking about how we can supplement the curriculum of the school. Last summer in France, the government did something very creative. They put on a series of summer camps for disadvantaged students that combined an element of curriculum catch-up with lots of fun and adventure and socialization. So we need to be creative, I think, about how we can do this learning recovery.
Yeah, if I may add, the focus on the whole child is something that's been picking up speed, before the pandemic, especially now, there's a lot of worry that students, affect will kind of be affected by the pandemic for a long time. And so, in cases where if students can't just sit and absorb all this material, it's fun and well-being that will really help them in the long run.
Great. Okay, Bethany, regarding the digital assessment, is there any way to predict whether a student would be unfairly impacted by digital assessment? For example, if they are not really familiar with the computer, they don't have the required technological skills.
Yeah, this is obviously a big concern. In Tim's and Pearl's, a lot of our countries are worried that their students will be disadvantaged, but so if we can't predict it, they're just designing the interface to just be easy to use, and also introduce digital activities in the classroom and get students familiar with it. Measuring students ability or familiarity to use computers has been shown very difficult in international studies. Some people measure it by confidence, students' confidence for their ability to do certain activities on computers. But really, it's just confidence in general. If students are confident, they tend to have higher achievement. We spent a lot of time at Tim's and Pearl's trying to develop, a digital self-efficacy familiarity scales to predict their digital achievement. But we found that after controlling, their confidence in mathematics, it really had no predictive power at all. And then measuring students' familiarity as to how often they use digital devices has also been difficult. I think in PISA, they call it a hill-shaped relationship with achievement. Too little computer use is associated with lower achievement, and too much use is associated with lower achievement, because sometimes students are just playing games all night and they're not studying. So they really need to study to do well on the test, and not just use the computer. And then in some countries and schools, technology is used to help students who need remediation. So if they're behind their class, they might be given a digital device and report using a digital device very often, but then they won't have higher achievement because they were underperforming to begin with. So with regard to making sure students are familiar, design the assessment carefully, and introduce computer activities in low stakes settings first.
Thank you. Tony, some schools are asking how can they, during these challenging times, how can they adapt their situation and be familiar with best practices so that they maintain the quality of their performance?
I think we need to go back to basics, really, in terms of our understanding of what effective teaching and learning looks like. I don't think the crisis has changed that. If anything, it's reminded us of the essential components of what great teachers do, and we need to go back to that. So what do great teachers do? Well, whether it's face-to-face or online, they structure engaging experiences that are pitched at the right academic level, and they put a particular focus on assessment. And I think the centrality of assessment for learning and the significance of the right kind of feedback has been absolutely, for me, reinforced by the experience of the period of school closure and reflections on what we should do as we seek to rebuild.
Thank you. Bethany, coming back to digital, all the questions about digital assessment and how it is reliable in testing other, it's all fine for testing maybe different subjects, but there are certain skills that can only be tested, for example, some might argue, through paper-based assessments, such as testing writing skills in languages. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's certainly a concern now that students, handwriting isn't being taught in some schools in the United States anymore, and it's definitely a concern. I think in the immediate future, students will be, writing on paper, and you can scan their paper for online scoring and start building capacity there. But right now, the stylus technologies that can be used on like a tablet or touch screen just aren't there. We actually thought we really wanted to transition TIMS to be a tablet and stylus based assessment, and the technology just isn't there. Students were not comfortable, and it's just not natural. The feeling of writing on a smooth surface is not conducive to good writing. There are some devices I know of that are new on the market that sort of have, they're a rough screen, and so it's a little bit more friction and feels more natural of writing. At least in the United States, these are being marketed more for note-taking, but I think that those could definitely have potential for a future in assessment.
Getting back to you, Tony, you mentioned about the role of parents during the current circumstances and the future. However, some might still argue that that they don't believe in the role of parents, and they solely believe that it's the role of a professional that should help with students' learning. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's similar in a way to my previous comment in that we knew these things before the crisis. We knew that parental engagement was very powerful, but that often culturally it's very difficult, and we've been maybe reminded of this fact. And what you say is absolutely right, and I think it's a universal phenomenon that in most countries certainly there will be parents who think, no, that's their job, over to you. But we know from the evidence that actually that does not help students. We know that, for example, with early grade reading, that family reading together is immensely powerful and can make a huge difference in terms of the progress of children with their first steps in literacy. We know obviously from the crisis that children have had very different experiences in terms of the extent to which they've been given a conducive home learning environment for their home-based work. Our own research, actually, in terms of looking at bright spots, we did, for us, a big study of the Vietnamese education system. Vietnam, it's famous for doing really well, actually, certainly is indicated by the PISA tests. And we went and had a look and said, well, what's working well around here? And there were lots and lots of different things. But we were particularly struck by the level of parental engagement in every aspect of the lives of the school. I think it makes a big difference. But you're right, it can be difficult. And so we must just take practical steps. We must explain to parents how they can help. And of course, almost all parents want fundamentally to do the right thing for their children. So schools need to be putting on workshops where they can be explaining in a very nice partnership fashion how the parents can help.
Thank you.
I would second what Tony said. Research shows like over and over, and every country's home environment is such a strong predictor of students' achievement. And The concept of a school climate that fosters academic excellence also includes involvement of parents in the school community and culture. And just to give a plug to digital assessment here is that sometimes, giving parents information more often about what's going on in school and the students' grades. And so using digital tools can help automate some of that process and communicate with parents more often.
Some again would say about it's fine to have the digital assessment, but what about testing the practical skills where there is a need for the use of apparatus handling skills, for example? So how would you handle that? Which these skills are necessarily for their education, for example, especially post-secondary education. So how would you handle such challenges? Where you have a practical skills such as handling the apparatus or...
Yeah. I mean, that for sure. I mean, instruction, you can't, as assessment will never, or online will never, be as using the actual equipment. We have experimented with ways, students can, interactively with digital, conduct an experiment, for example, but you still need to be able to, think about, reflect on experience and having actual experience using the equipment will help with the assessment later. So.
Thank you, Bethany. I think we have for time for one more question. Tony, a lot of teachers believe that the current circumstances are challenging enough without the concept of accountability. How do you resonate that with the lesson that you presented?
Sure, I understand that, and I respect that. And there is a big issue about teacher well-being and teacher mental health, and I'm not belittling those questions. But I think also we need somebody to advocate for the child and to look at the what's happening from the perspective of the child. And I like to make a distinction between smart accountability and dumb accountability. So it is possible to do accountability very badly and to demoralize and frighten. And no, that's not a good idea. But it's also possible to have smart accountability that incentivize good practice, that provides a framework and a vocabulary for thinking about quality, that identifies and celebrates the best things that are happening. And I think this is what we need. And if we want teaching to be seen rightly as one of the top professions, we need to get this balance right between high accountability, but also high respect, high support. The two go together for me.
Thank you so much. Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for your ideas and for sharing your input. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
نشكر ضيوفنا الخبراء على أوراق العمل المميزة التي تم طرحها اليوم. ضيوفنا الكرام، نود إبلاغكم بأن هناك غرف للمحادثة موزعة بحسب إدارات الهيئة للمدارس الحكومية والخاصة والامتحانات الوطنية ومؤسسات التدريب المهني وأيضا مؤسسات التعليم العالي والإطار الوطني للمؤهلات. هذه الغرف ستكون مفتوحة قبل وبعد الجلسات. نتمنى إن شاء الله مشاركتكم الفاعلة بما يثير خبرات ويحقق أهداف هذا المؤتمر. والآن ندعو الجميع لأخذ استراحة لمدة 15 دقيقة، نعود بعدها بإذن الله لمواصلة جلسات مؤتمرنا هذا، حيث تعقد الجلسة الثانية بعنوان جودة التعليم العالي في عالم متغير، الأمور الملحة في ظل التعليم الافتراضي. ودمتم بخير. شكرا.